Hey guys, tonight we're going way back. Like really far, around 5,000 years ago, give or take a few awkward centuries of sandstorms and sun gods. You're standing at the edge of the Nile Valley, just as the sun starts to dip below the golden horizon. The wind is warm and dry, brushing against your face like parchment, and the scent in the air is dust and old stone, maybe with a hint of lotus flower and something slightly burned. It's oddly comforting. You're here for a reason. A strange one, actually. You want to understand why the ancient Egyptians spent literal centuries mastering the art of turning dead people into human beef jerky. Sorry, not quite beef jerky. More like sacred, divinely preserved time capsules of the human form. But still, the idea of wrapping someone up for the afterlife like a Chipotle burrito with 70 layers of gauze? It's a little intense. And spoiler alert, if you lived here and died, you probably wouldn't have gotten the deluxe mummy treatment unless you were rolling in grain, gold, or divine favor. For the rest of us, well, let's just say the afterlife might involve a lot more sand and awkward places. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little journey travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking along a thin dirt path that hugs the Nile, the moonlight glinting off the slow, snaking water. Palm trees sway above you like silent witnesses. Somewhere behind you, a hippo grunts lazily, and you try to pretend it's not making eye contact. Ahead, there's a flicker of firelight. You step closer. The scent of resin and incense grows stronger, mingling with something faintly sweet, slightly spoiled. You wrinkle your nose. That might be someone's uncle. The embalming tent looks nothing like you imagined. No gold. No fanfare. Just a set of rough-hewn tables, a few solemn men in linen kilts, and a body lying still under the moonlight. You glance down. Yep, definitely a body. You try not to stare. But you're fascinated. Because here, death isn't the end. It's more like step one of a very long, very bureaucratic journey to eternal paradise. You know, like renewing your driver's license, but with scarabs and crocodile-headed judges. The Egyptians didn't believe in oblivion. They believed in forever. In a realm called the Duat, a shimmering otherworld where souls could roam, feast, and relive the best parts of life, but only if they made it through an intense set of trials, spell recitations, and spiritual paperwork. And most importantly, you had to show up looking good. See, the body was crucial. Not because they were vain, though, have you seen their jewelry? But because the Ka, a kind of spiritual twin, needed the body as a home base. No body? No Ka. No Ka? No afterlife brunch buffet. And that would be tragic. So, what do you do if you're worried your decaying mortal coil might, well, decay too fast? You fight nature with ritual. You slow time with natron, linen, and prayer. You create the mummy. And yes, this all started thousands of years ago. As early as 3500 BC, people were already experimenting with preserving the dead. Back then, it was more sand-based than science-based. Picture this: you die, and your family lovingly places you in a shallow grave in the desert. No coffin. No fuss. Just sand. But that desert heat? It's a miracle worker. It basically dehydrates you faster than a kale chip in a food dehydrator. It didn't take long for people to notice that those shallow graves kept corpses surprisingly intact. Hair, skin, even facial expressions stuck around like they were waiting for a selfie. Cue the spiritual epiphany. What if, they wondered, this preservation wasn't just a lucky accident? What if it was a divine sign? A cosmic clue? An instruction manual written in dust and heat? And thus began the obsession. Of course, it wasn't just about staying fresh. Egyptians believed that your name, your image, and your physical form were all ingredients in your post-death survival kit. If one got erased, say your tomb was vandalized or your body decomposed, you might disappear entirely. Like an old file on a corrupted USB drive. Poof. So pharaohs, nobles, and eventually even well-off merchants began investing in the art of embalming. At first, it was simple. A dry grave, maybe a reed mat. But by 2600 BC, we start seeing real rituals. Real tools. Real resin. And real fear of death, of decay, of being forgotten. Some scholars argue that this fear of impermanence, of the body crumbling and taking the soul with it, was one of the core anxieties of ancient Egypt. Others say it was more about religion, symbolism, and demonstrating power. Either way, you have to admit, it led to some impressively meticulous work. And like all things human, the practice evolved. Priests developed secret techniques. Embalmers guarded formulas like trade secrets. Families saved for years to afford even the most basic preparation. The dead became projects, carefully curated, spiritually significant, and, let's be honest, kind of high maintenance. You step back from the tent. A breeze picks up, stirring the papyrus reeds. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the clatter of tools and the murmur of prayers. You feel the weight of time pressing gently on your shoulders, like a warm blanket laced with the scent of old stories. Above you, the stars glitter. Orion watches. Sirius gleams. These were not just stars to the Egyptians, they were deities, companions, navigators of the soul. You think of a man, once flesh and bone, now wrapped in linen, his heart light as a feather, drifting through the night sky in a boat of dreams. And maybe, just maybe, you begin to understand. Because here, under the ancient moon, with your feet in the dust of millennia, death isn't scary. It's a passage. A promise. A strange, sacred art. Just don't forget to moisturize. The desert is brutal. The stars haven't moved much, but you feel yourself drifting, deeper into this ancient realm where time folds in on itself like linen wrapped tight around a royal corpse. You're still near the Nile, but now the world feels older. Grander. You're no longer on the fringes of ceremony. You're walking into power. Into permanence. A figure approaches you. Tall. Robed. Regal. His brow is marked with a cobra-shaped uraeus, and gold glimmers faintly from his collar in the torchlight. This isn't just anyone. This is a pharaoh. A god on earth, at least by his own PR team's standards. He doesn't speak, but you can feel it, the weight of his immortality, or at least his desperate desire for it. Here's the thing. You can't be a divine king and then rot like some goat herder out in the delta. That's bad optics. So, pharaohs had a real incentive to make sure their bodies outlived their reigns. And their reigns were long, if they were lucky. But eternity? That's a bigger promise. You'd need more than a pyramid scheme to pull that off. The Old Kingdom, around 2600 BC, is when things started to get truly serious. Picture vast stone tombs rising from the sands, not for shelter, but for status. The earliest pyramids, like Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, weren't just tombs, they were monuments to staying power. Monuments to the idea that your body could last as long as the stones around it. And the mummification? It became a system. A production line for forever. But of course, it wasn't perfect. Early mummies? Kind of a mess. Sometimes they forgot to remove the brain, which turned to mush and leaked. Sometimes they skipped the resin, so everything got soft. Let's just say, trial and error isn't a great look when you're trying to be eternal. Still, they learned. They experimented. By the time of the 4th dynasty, around when Khufu built the Great Pyramid, embalming had become ritualized. The process wasn't just about technique anymore. It was about symbolism. About staging your death as a spiritual performance. Step 1. Cleanse the body. Usually with palm wine and Nile water, like a really intense spa day. Step 2. Yank out the brain. Through the nose. Using a hook tool. You don't need it in the afterlife, apparently. Which is either comforting or terrifying, depending on how you feel about your cognitive skills. Step 3. Slice open the side and remove the organs. But not the heart. That was the VIP organ. Egyptians believed your heart recorded all your actions, like a cosmic Fitbit. You'd need it during the final judgment, when it would be weighed against a feather. Yes, a literal feather. The feather of Maat, goddess of truth. Too heavy? Your heart gets eaten by a monster named Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo. Basically, the worst zoo animal imaginable. End of story. No afterlife buffet for you. Too light? Congrats. You pass. Your soul floats away to an eternity of feasting and napping under palm trees. With cats. Probably. Anyway, back to the organs. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were each cleaned, dried, and placed into special jars called canopic jars. These weren't just Tupperware for the dead. Each one was protected by a different god, shaped like animals: baboon, jackal, falcon, and human-headed. The 4 sons of Horus, if you're keeping track. This practice, oddly enough, wasn't always consistent. Some mummies didn't get jars. Some got fake jars, just for appearances. Others had their organs wrapped and shoved back into the body, like a weirdly thoughtful regifting ritual. Historians still debate why the practices varied so much. Was it wealth? Region? Priestly politics? Maybe Uncle Thebes had a hookup in the embalming guild, and Aunt Memphis didn't. What we do know is that by the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC, the mummification process had hit its golden stride. Bodies were drained, packed with natron, a salty mineral that absorbed moisture, and left to dry for 40 days. 40. Not 39. Not 41. Someone somewhere decided that was the divine drying time, like baking instructions from the gods. Once dry, the body was anointed with oils and resins, part preservation, part offering. Then came the wrapping. And oh, the wrapping! Not just a few turns of cloth, but hundreds of feet of linen, layered, padded, sometimes inscribed with spells. Fingers and toes were wrapped individually, like each one needed its own passport to the afterlife. You pause in the dark, trying to imagine it. The heat of the torch. The smell of frankincense. The hushed chants. And the body, once a king, a father, a living god, now transformed into a still, quiet vessel. Ready to journey into forever. But don't be fooled. This wasn't some quiet, solemn affair. This was elite branding. A pharaoh's burial was a statement. The wrapping wasn't just protective, it was performative. It said, "I am important enough for 100 workers to spend 70 days on my corpse. You think you're fancy with your monogram towels? Please." And the tomb? That was a whole other production. Art on the wall showing daily life, offerings, lists of possessions, servants drawn at full height. Spells painted in blue and gold. The pharaoh was preparing to live again, just not here. Not now. You might wonder why they went to such extremes. Why not just, move on? Because for the ancient Egyptians, this was moving on. Death wasn't the end. It was a transformation. A continuation. A deeply sacred transition that required as much attention as your actual life. Maybe more. And perhaps you start to feel it now, how the body was more than just a shell. It was a story. A memory in flesh. And preserving it wasn't vanity. It was reverence. A way of saying, "This mattered. I mattered." Somewhere behind you, the Nile murmurs. The breeze shifts. You hear a low voice chanting a hymn to Osiris, god of the dead, whose own dismembered body had once been reassembled and restored, becoming the ultimate mummy. The blueprint for all that followed. You think about permanence. About the desire to be remembered. To remain whole. And you wonder, if someone wrapped your body with this much care, with prayers stitched into every layer of cloth, would that be enough to carry your name across time? You smile softly in the dark. Probably not. But hey, at least you don't have to deal with canopic jars. The torchlight flickers again, this time catching on the rim of something pale and smooth, a jar, tucked into the shadows at the edge of the chamber. You step closer, your sandals crunching softly on the packed earth. 4 jars, actually. Lined up in formation like little clay sentinels. Their lids are sculpted into heads. One looks vaguely like a monkey, another like a bird with a curved beak. One has the face of a stern man. And then, a jackal. You try not to imagine its eyes following you. You've found the canopic jars. And inside? Organs. Yep. Real ones. Dried, perfumed, and packaged like organic farmers' market offal, sealed for their journey through eternity. Let's back up. Remember the bit about removing internal organs? The ancient Egyptians believed these parts of the body needed separate protection. They weren't just tossed aside or burned. Each was sacred. And more importantly, each had a role to play in the afterlife. You can't just waltz into paradise missing your spleen. It's like showing up to the airport without your luggage. Now, the Egyptians didn't keep all the organs. The brain, famously, was considered disposable. Soft, unimportant, messy. Embalmers would use a metal hook, sometimes bronze, sometimes silver, and insert it through the nose to scramble it like a divine omelet, then drain it out or pull it in chunks. Super glamorous. Modern scientists still aren't entirely sure how effective this technique was. In some mummies, brain bits were found still inside, dried and clinging to the skull. Others seem to have had the full clean out. Either way, the ancient embalmers made it work, with about as much precision as you'd expect from someone working by torchlight in a linen skirt. But the heart? That was the one. Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of emotion, memory, will, and morality. Basically, it was your soul's resume. When you died, your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth, justice, and cosmic order. Too heavy with sin, and, well, we covered that last time. Hungry hippo monster. End credits. Too light? Your heart might float like a leaf, pure and unburdened. Some texts even describe it rising into the sky, joining the stars. A kind of celestial promotion. Now here's where it gets weird. Despite the heart's importance, some mummies are missing theirs. Not accidentally. Surgically removed. Researchers still debate this. Did embalmers take the heart out for separate rituals? Was it sometimes destroyed? Could it have been a form of punishment, or just embalming gone wrong? Some tombs contain little heart-shaped amulets instead, carved from carnelian or green feldspar, placed carefully on the chest. Like saying, "Oops, lost the original. Please accept this decorative substitute." Historians still argue about it. There are theories and counter-theories, endless debates in journals with titles like Mummification and the Moral Physiology of the Heart. It's delightfully nerdy. And beautifully human. But let's go back to those jars. Each organ, stomach, intestines, lungs, liver, was assigned a specific protector. And these weren't just arbitrary gods. These were the four sons of Horus, divine guardians with impressive resumes. Imsidi, the human-headed jar, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed one, took care of the lungs. Duamutef, the jackal-headed figure, protected the stomach. Kabasanuf, falcon-headed and fierce, oversaw the intestines. Their lids were shaped to reflect their patron's visage, and sometimes the jars were painted in vibrant colors. You imagine them glowing under the light of 1,000 oil lamps, lined up neatly beside a golden sarcophagus. Like VIP guests at a party you really don't want to be late for. Sometimes the jars were real, containing the actual organs. Other times they were symbolic, empty, or filled with substitutes. Clay replicas, resin figurines. And sometimes there were decoy jars. 4 beautifully carved jars, with nothing inside. Just for show. Because even in death, appearances mattered. It wasn't just royalty who used them either. Over time, the practice trickled down the social ladder. Nobles, priests, and wealthy merchants all got in on the jar game. Some even had mass-produced ones. Think ancient catalog shopping for the afterlife. You run your fingers along the edge of one jar. It's smooth, cool, and covered in tiny carved hieroglyphs. Maybe they're spells. Maybe they're prayers. Maybe someone just liked writing. Property of Dumutef. Over and over. The air here feels charged. Like memory soaked into stone. You picture the embalmers, stoic, meticulous, hands stained with resin and ash, gently lifting each organ, wrapping it in linen, whispering incantations. They weren't just butchers. They were craftsmen. Healers of the dead. And while you're still trying to process all this organ management, something catches your eye. A small golden scarab, lying on the ground, half buried in dust. You crouch to pick it up. It's cool and surprisingly heavy. On the underside, there's an inscription, tiny, precise, almost humming with meaning. This is a heart scarab. A special kind of amulet placed over the chest, meant to protect the soul from testifying against itself in the afterlife. Yes, that's right. The Egyptians were worried that in the presence of divine judgment, your own heart might snitch. So, they inscribed spells to silence it. Basically, "Dear heart, don't tell them about the thing with the stolen figs and the donkey. Just don't." You can't help but smile. Even 5,000 years ago, people were already worried about saying the wrong thing in court. Some modern scholars argue that the complexity of these burial practices reflected an increasingly bureaucratic afterlife. As Egyptian religion evolved, so did its demands. More gods, more rules, more steps. It wasn't enough to just be dead and hopeful. You had to be prepared. Others say it was about love. About honoring the body, the spirit, and the life lived. About surrounding someone with symbols of care and remembrance. Maybe both ideas are true. You place the scarab gently back where you found it. Outside, the wind has picked up again. You hear the rush of reeds. The water of the Nile shifting against the banks. And a faint sound, music, drifting in from somewhere deep in the tomb. You step toward it, drawn by something ancient and tender. A reminder that even in the silence of death, there were songs to be sung. Stories to be carried. And maybe, a heart, waiting to be weighed. You follow the music. Soft, almost hypnotic, it leads you through a narrow corridor where the stone walls close in just enough to make you lower your shoulders. Every few steps, your fingers brush symbols, hieroglyphs carved deep into limestone, filled once with paint, now faded to whispers. The air is dry and sweet, like old wood and something else. Something almost floral, but tinged with the unmistakable scent of decay that's been carefully, methodically suppressed. You round a corner and suddenly find yourself in a chamber awash with gold light. Braziers burn low in the corners, and at the center is a stone table. Upon it lies a body, half wrapped in linen, halfway to forever. The music isn't music, not really. It's chanting. Deep and rhythmic, layered in tones. Embalmers in white robes move slowly around the table, anointing the body with a thick, syrupy substance that gleams under the flickering flames. You lean in and inhale. The smell is powerful. Resinous. Sharp, like pine and frankincense, but darker, smokier. It grabs the back of your throat, fills your sinuses, and wraps around your brain like a memory you didn't know you had. If the afterlife had a cologne, this would be it. Welcome to the world of sacred resin. You watch as the embalmers paint the body with layers of warm, glistening sap. This is merit, a blend of resin and oils used to seal the body from moisture, bacteria, and anything else that might interrupt one's scheduled eternity. It wasn't just any resin. The Egyptians imported it from far-off lands, Lebanon, Punt, maybe even India. Frankincense, myrrh, pine, cedar. To them, these weren't just tree juices. They were gifts from the gods. Perfume proof that you were worth preserving. They didn't always know where these materials came from. That didn't stop them from weaving legends. Myrrh, they said, was the sweat of divine beings. Frankincense? A solidified breath from the gods' nostrils. Dramatic, sure, but also kind of poetic. What mattered most was this: the smell itself was sacred. A sign that the divine was present. As the resins melt into the corpse's skin, a priest raises his hand. He chants something low and slow, likely part of the opening of the mouth ceremony. This wasn't just about scent and stickiness. This was magic. The opening of the mouth was a complex ritual meant to awaken the senses of the dead. The eyes, so they could see the afterlife. The ears, to hear the voice of the gods. The mouth, to speak one's name and plead for a good judgment. And what tool did they use for this ceremony? You'll love this. Sometimes, it was a spoon. Okay, not just any spoon. A sacred adze, a ceremonial tool shaped like a spoon or hoe, symbolically tapping the mouth, nose, and ears. Other times, it was made of stone, gold, or even meteoric iron. Yes, metal from space. Because nothing says divine transition like being anointed with a space rock. You glance around the chamber again. There are pots lined up neatly along the walls. Some contain more resin, thick and glassy. Others are filled with oils, lotus, cedar, juniper. You spot a brush made of bundled reeds. And something that looks suspiciously like a spatula. You begin to realize something. This isn't a funeral. It's a transformation. A ritual of alchemy, turning flesh into eternity. You shift your gaze back to the body, now fully coated. The linen wrapping will come later, but first comes this careful layering of protection. The resin seals the pores, prevents bacteria, preserves the shape of the body like a lacquered sculpture. The ancient embalmers didn't know the word antimicrobial, but they sure knew what worked. Here's the strange part. In some periods, they used so much resin that the body essentially became a hardened shell. In others, they used less, focusing on perfuming and softening the skin instead. There's one mummy in the British Museum, dating to the 21st dynasty, where the resin was poured so liberally that the body actually stuck to the coffin. Unwrap it? Impossible. The coffin is the mummy now. Historians still argue about why the techniques varied so much. Was it about wealth? Geography? Embalmer fashion trends? Maybe some families preferred a high-gloss finish. Others wanted more of a matte, natural look. Who knows? You spot a second body nearby, already wrapped. Unlike the first, this one has been painted. Gold leaf clings to the face. Black lines trace the eyes like divine eyeliner. The resin used here was tinted, dyed with ochre, creating a reddish-brown finish that made the corpse appear more lifelike. It's unsettling. And oddly beautiful. You think about modern embalming, how we drain, inject, powder, preserve. It's clinical. Sterile. This feels like a performance. A final act stage for gods and ghosts alike. And sometimes, it was rushed. There are records, both written and physical, of mummies who weren't dried long enough. Who were wrapped too soon. The result? Leaks. Slippage. Smells. One tomb in Thebes revealed dozens of elite corpses stored together in a mass cache, some well preserved, others in states of alarming greenness. Even the greats had their mishaps. Ramses II, arguably the most powerful pharaoh in history, was found with his nose badly broken and his wrappings less than ideal. It happens to the best of us. Still, you sense that the goal was always the same: preservation as an act of love, of honor, of identity. Because in Egypt, to lose your smell, your shape, your form, was to vanish from the universe. To be forgotten. You kneel beside the brazier and warm your hands. The scent clings to your skin. You wonder how many hands have done this before, gently, solemnly, one resinous swipe at a time. And you wonder, if your body were to last 5,000 years, would it still smell like hope? You breathe in again. The air is heavy, sacred. Sweet. Somewhere above, the stars keep shining. And just for a moment, you feel wrapped in something invisible. Like linen. Like time. Like memory itself. You step out of the resin-scented chamber and into another corridor, narrower, cooler. The stone underfoot is worn smooth by generations of footsteps, priests, mourners, embalmers, maybe even the dead themselves, carried lovingly or reluctantly down these same twisting halls. The air here is thick with a new aroma. Not the sharp sacredness of myrrh, but something more pungent. Earthier. Fishier? You hesitate. And then it hits you. Somewhere in these winding tombs, someone has cracked open a jar of, well, it's hard to say, but your nostrils are definitely offended. You fight the urge to gag. Ancient Egypt, for all its glory, was not always glamorous. This is the less sacred side of mummification. The cosmetic tricks. The masking of unpleasant truths. The glamorous cover-up job designed not only for spiritual protection, but also for sensory survival. Because the dead, no matter how royal, still smell like death. So, the embalmers got creative. And oh, the things they used. Let's start with one of the more unexpected ingredients: crocodile dung. Yes. Crocodile dung. It wasn't applied to the corpses, thank goodness, but it was used in everyday cosmetics, including sunscreen and contraceptives, and sometimes appeared in mortuary rituals, possibly as part of protection or purification rites. You wonder, not for the first time, who looked at a sunbathing crocodile and thought, That's what I'll smear on my face. But hey, ancient science was about experimentation. And Egypt, in all its heat and dust, was a crucible of both medicine and magic. The line between the two? Very blurry. In burial prep, embalmers often applied thick pastes made from animal fat, beeswax, and ochre. Not only did these moisturize the skin of the deceased, because nobody wants to look ashy on their way to paradise, they also served as sealing agents. Think of it like a primer coat before the big linen wrap. They even used chalky white powders on the faces of the dead. Not for spiritual reasons, but for aesthetics. A pale face meant purity, serenity. It also covered up any blotchy discoloration. Like a posthumous Instagram filter. And then came the oils. Oh, the oils. Cedar oil was a favorite. Its sharp, antiseptic scent not only masked decay but slowed it. Juniper and lotus were also used, creating a kind of aromatic bouquet. Imagine being preserved in the scent of a high-end essential oils boutique. Kind of nice, actually. But embalming wasn't just a sensory spa day. It was presentation. Nobles sometimes requested kohl-lined eyes, even in death. That classic black eyeliner you picture on Cleopatra? The dead wore it too. Not for flirtation, but for protection. Kohl, made from ground galena, was believed to ward off evil spirits and infections. Lips were tinted with red ochre. Cheeks slightly dusted with rose mineral. You know, just a subtle glow before eternity. And let's not forget wigs. Yes, wigs. You peer into an alcove and spot something peculiar. A row of human hair wigs, some still clinging to their carved wooden heads. Egyptians, especially elites, valued luscious hair, even in death. If the deceased had lost their hair during illness or age, a wig was added. Styled. Braided. Sometimes perfumed. One particularly vain noblewoman, whose mummy was discovered near Deir el-Bahri, had not only a wig but beads woven into it. Her burial instructions included a full cosmetic case and a mirror. Because, let's face it, just because you're dead doesn't mean you stop caring about your look. There's a kind of sweetness in that. You pass by another shelf where bottles rest quietly. Some are still sealed. Inside? Fragrant unguents. The scent of memory, preserved for 5,000 years. And sometimes, they used fake body parts. That's right. You glance down a side corridor and spot a small linen-wrapped bundle. A toe, maybe? Or a finger. Sometimes, during preparation, things fell off. And instead of tossing them, disrespectful, the embalmers would make replacements. Wooden digits. Linen stuffed ears. Even painted clay noses. One mummy was found with a prosthetic big toe, carefully attached with leather ties. It wasn't just decorative, it had been worn in life, too. Possibly one of the earliest known examples of a functional prosthesis. A reminder that even millennia ago, people still wanted to walk with dignity. But not all cosmetic enhancements were so noble. Some mummies were padded. That's right. As the body shriveled and collapsed inward, embalmers sometimes stuffed the cheeks and limbs with linen or sawdust to make the corpse look fuller, plumper, more lifelike. One pharaoh, Amenhotep III, was so extensively stuffed and painted that when he was unwrapped in the 19th century, he looked disturbingly fresh. Like he'd just stepped out of a spa, if the spa was also a tomb. And let's not forget the smiles. There's at least one example of a mummy whose lips were stitched into a faint grin. Historians still don't know why. Was it an aesthetic preference? A symbolic gesture? A mortuary joke? Theories vary. But one thing is clear, the Egyptians cared. They didn't just want the body to survive. They wanted it to look good. To look loved. As if the person within might still rise, stretch, and ask for their favorite robe. You pause beside a linen-wrapped mannequin, used for training apprentice embalmers. It's crude, with hollow eye sockets and lumpy padding, but you can sense the reverence behind it. Every curve of fabric, every drop of resin, it was all done with intent. Even the fishy smells. You close your eyes. In the darkness, you hear laughter from a marketplace long gone. The splash of water in a fountain. The murmur of a family preparing a loved one for rest, not with grief, but with care. With perfumes, wigs, eyeliner, and love. And then, very faintly, the scent shifts again. Lotus. Myrrh. A whiff of something like cinnamon. You smile. Who knew eternity could smell this elaborate? You've seen the oils, the resins, the organs in jars. You've smelled the lotus and the fish poop. Now it's time for the linen. You duck under a low stone lintel and find yourself in a long, quiet chamber, lit only by the flicker of torchlight bouncing off ivory-colored walls. The smell of old cloth fills your nose, clean, dusty, slightly metallic. You're surrounded by rolls upon rolls of linen, stacked in neat bundles like the fabric section of an eternal department store. You walk slowly, running your hand along one of the bundles. The weave is fine, tighter than you expected. Not rough like burlap, but smooth, almost soft. This isn't just any cloth. This is burial linen, prepared with care, often looted from temple donations, and sometimes even repurposed from royal wardrobes. Imagine that, being wrapped in something that once belonged to a priest or a pharaoh's tunic. The ultimate vintage look. And this is where the magic begins. Because while removing organs and slathering the body in resin was essential, the true transformation into a mummy didn't happen until the wrapping. You hear footsteps. A procession enters. Priests dressed in white, head shaved, hands steady. They gather around a body laid flat on a wooden table. It's been cleaned, dried, oiled. It's ready. One of the priests lifts the first strip of linen. You expect him to move fast, like someone rolling up a rug. He doesn't. The motion is slow. Reverent. Like folding a flag at a soldier's funeral. He whispers as he lays the cloth across the chest, words not for you, but for the gods. For the Ka, the Ba, the name. For the soul that still lingers. The second strip follows. Then another. And another. You blink, and it's been minutes. And they're only on the left arm. Each finger is wrapped individually. Each toe. The limbs, the torso, the neck. Not in one giant pass, but in layers, each bound with intention. Some layers are soaked in oils. Others are dry. Some have amulets tucked inside, tiny scarabs, protective eyes, even little figurines of gods. One priest pauses to place a wedjat, the eye of Horus, over the heart. Another inserts a strip of linen inscribed with spells, a kind of supernatural cheat sheet. The wrappings aren't just for preservation. They're armor. Symbolic layers meant to shield the soul from danger, confusion, and cosmic paperwork. After all, the Duat, the Egyptian afterlife, wasn't a leisurely stroll through clouds. It was a perilous journey through serpent-filled caverns, fiery gates, and tricky judges. You'd want to be dressed appropriately. So, they wrapped you like a god. And in some cases, literally as a god. High-status mummies often had masks placed over their heads, made of cartonnage, a kind of ancient papier-mâché, or in rare cases, solid gold. These weren't just representations of the deceased. They were stylized faces of Osiris, god of the afterlife. To wrap someone like Osiris was to transform them. To declare, "This person is now divine." The process could take weeks. 70 days was the traditional mourning period, and much of that time was spent wrapping, layering, blessing, sealing. Some mummies have been found with 300 or more separate pieces of linen, each one carefully wound. Some strips are stamped with ink prayers. Others are dyed with symbolic colors, red for protection, yellow for the sun. One mummy, found in Darobari, had spells hidden in her bandages, tiny papyri tucked like secrets into the folds. Another had beads sewn into the cloth, creating a shimmering net of blue and green, like a river flowing over her body. Not everyone got this deluxe treatment, of course. Poorer Egyptians had simpler wrappings, fewer layers, no amulets, and maybe a second-hand shroud. But even then, they followed the same logic: protect the body, preserve the spirit. And the head? Special attention. The mouth was often stuffed with resin-soaked cloth. The eyes sometimes replaced with stones or onions. Yes, onions. Not to make the gods cry, but because onions were seen as symbols of life. Their many layers represented eternity. You crouched next to the table, watching as the final strips are wound around the feet. The priest steps back and begins a slow circling chant. Others sprinkle natron across the floor. One holds a feather fan, not for cooling, but to wave away evil spirits. There's a hush now. The wrapping is complete. Before you can rise, a younger priest steps forward and pulls out a pot of thick, black resin. With a narrow reed, he seals the final knot with a drop of the dark liquid. Like a wax seal on a sacred letter. The wrapping is done. But you notice something curious. Near the base of the table lies a small basket. Inside are discarded linen scraps, some clean, some stained, some inscribed. You ask yourself, why discard sacred cloth? Turns out, embalmers were picky. If a strip tore, or didn't wrap just right, they'd toss it and start over. Some were later burned in rituals. Others buried in special linen pits. And some were reused in future mummifications. Recycling, ancient style. You wander over to the back wall, where fragments of linen hang like quiet flags. One has a faint inscription. May your name be spoken, and your steps remembered. There's something so gentle about that. Not just survival, but remembrance. Because to the Egyptians, death wasn't silence. It was a story. And the wrappings? The way you're prepared and presented? That was the first chapter of your afterlife. You look again at the now fully wrapped figure on the table. Silent. Shimmering faintly with the oils and resins. No longer just a body. Now a symbol. A vessel. A hope. And wrapped so tightly that even time can't quite pull it apart. The chamber of linen fades behind you, but the quiet weight of it, those hundreds of careful wrappings, each one a whispered prayer, still clings to your thoughts. You move through a darker passage now. Cooler. The stone beneath your feet feels smoother, more polished, as if worn not just by footsteps, but by ritual. You sense you're getting closer to something final. And then, in the flicker of the torchlight, you see it. The book. No, not a book. Not bound in leather, not shelved neatly. But a scroll, wide and tall and unrolling endlessly across the stone wall, inked in rich blacks and reds. Vignettes march along its length, tiny gods, standing figures, boats crossing star-filled skies, serpents curled in rings, and birds with human heads. You've arrived at the next essential component of a good mummification, the spiritual paperwork. Because no matter how clean, wrapped, and resin-packed your body was, you weren't getting anywhere in the afterlife without the Book of the Dead. Or at least, a version of it. Despite its dramatic modern name, the Book of the Dead wasn't one single book. It was a customizable collection of spells, prayers, hymns, and instructions designed to help the deceased navigate the terrifyingly bureaucratic landscape of the do-it. You know how modern taxes come with dense instruction manuals and line-by-line breakdowns? Imagine that, but for your soul. Welcome to ancient Egypt's ultimate travel guide. And the name they actually used? The Book of Coming Forth by Day. It sounds poetic, like a sunrise. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. These texts were meant to help the soul re-emerge into the light of the afterlife, fully intact and spiritually certified. You kneel beside a small chest. Inside are scrolls, papyrus sheets carefully rolled, tied with cords, some sealed with wax. You pick one up. The ink is still visible. Black for the body of the text, red for instructions and divine names. You spot a familiar image, a scarab beetle, wings spread, holding up the sun. The beetle, or keeper, wasn't just some random bug. It was a symbol of rebirth, because the Egyptians believed the sun rolled across the sky like a scarab pushing a ball of dung. Yes, dung. Nature's most humbling metaphor. Some mummies were buried with beetle amulets inside their chests, near the heart. Others had winged scarabs embroidered into their wrappings. But in the texts, the beetle was often shown flying, transforming from lowly insect to divine guide. And you? You're watching a soul's roadmap unfold. Spell 125 catches your eye. This is the weighing of the heart scene. The part where the deceased stands before Osiris, flanked by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, and Thoth, the ibis-headed god of scribes. It's Judgment Day, ancient Egyptian style. The heart is placed on one side of a scale. On the other side? The feather of Ma'at, truth, balance, justice. And if the scale tips the wrong way? Cue Ammit, the soul-eating chimera. Crocodile jaws, lion's mane, hippo haunches. She lounges under the scale, looking bored but hungry. One false confession, and she snaps you up like a snack-sized pack of guilt. But if the scale balances? Then you're allowed to come forth by day, to live again in the field of reeds, a beautiful, endless version of Egypt where you could farm without toil, fish without nets, and drink beer that never ran dry. The priests painted these images in tombs. wrote the spells on shrouds, carved them into sarcophagi. Sometimes the spells were inscribed directly onto the linen wrappings, layer after layer of magic woven into the fabric of the dead. Not everyone could afford a full book of the Dead Scroll, so they improvised. Some bought only key spells, sold like aftermarket blessings. Others copied excerpts onto cheap papyrus or linen scraps. You might find a single spell, worn around the neck or hidden in the wrappings, like a lucky charm in a cosmic courtroom. The most important spells included things like how to avoid being decapitated by demons with knives, how to convince the gods you never stole bread, how to remember your own name. Seriously, that was a thing. Forgetting your name meant spiritual annihilation. You step deeper into the chamber. On one wall, you find a massive mural showing a soul confronting a series of gatekeepers. Each one has a name like He who knoweth the names, or She who demandeth the sacred syllable. It's like a password-protected journey through the world's most intense escape room. To pass, the soul had to recite passwords, secret names, lines of defense. And where did they find these? Yep, in the spells. That's why you weren't buried without your spiritual cheat sheet. Even kings, who had entire tombs painted with full books worth of spells, often carried smaller versions with them. Little amulet-shaped books, tattooed prayers, backup scrolls. Because one misplaced name, one forgotten line, and you might wander the duet forever. You wonder, who wrote these? Some were commissioned by the family, written by professional scribes, priests trained not only in ink and grammar, but in cosmic navigation. They didn't just copy words. They crafted magic. The scrolls were often made to order, with spaces left blank for the deceased's name to be filled in later, sort of like the ancient world's version of insert name here. You glance down at one such scroll. The name is barely visible. Worn, smudged, maybe forgotten. And in that, something tugs at you. Because this whole elaborate system, organs, wrappings, beetles, and books, it all comes down to one thing. To be remembered. To speak your name. To see the sun. To cross the river of night and rise again in morning light. You press your palm to the stone. And somewhere, in the dark, you feel the echo of a soul still whispering its passwords to the stars. The murals fade behind you, and once again you're swallowed by the dim corridors. But your mind is buzzing, with spells, passwords, amulets, feathers, and crocodile monsters. The ancient Egyptians weren't kidding around with the afterlife. And just when you think things might quiet down, you hear a new sound. Thunk. Clack. Shuffle. You follow it down a low tunnel, the ceiling brushing your head. Then the passage opens into a wide chamber, stone walls, sand-swept floor, and a door. But not just any door. This one is carved directly into the stone, framed by twin cobras, their hoods flared. The surface is painted to look like wood, but it doesn't open. Not really. In fact, it's not a door at all. It's a fake door. You blink then chuckle. A fake door in a tomb? Of course. Because in a world where the afterlife is a journey, why not furnish your final resting place with all the conveniences of the living? And this, you realize, was part of the grand illusion, making the tomb feel alive, even as it sealed away the dead. Fake doors were standard features in tombs, especially for nobles and pharaohs. They weren't there for decoration. They were symbolic gateways between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A place where offerings could be left, and where the spirit could pass through, receive them, and returned to rest. Offerings like bread, beer, incense, and roasted duck. Because apparently, being dead didn't mean giving up your favorite snacks. But it wasn't all gentle symbolism and quiet ritual. Some of these tombs? They were booby-trapped. Literally. You step deeper into the chamber and notice oddities. A hallway that veers sharply, only to end in a blank wall. A side passage that loops back on itself. In one corner, a vertical shaft plunges into blackness, like a forgotten elevator shaft. The ancient Egyptians had trick architecture, designed to confuse, mislead, and trap anyone who didn't belong. Mostly tomb robbers. But maybe a few confused spirits too. You see, the wealthier the burial, the more likely it was to attract attention. And that meant serious tomb security. Some tombs were equipped with false burial chambers, beautifully decorated, but empty. Just a decoy. Hidden doors behind painted walls. Loose ceiling blocks that could fall if a thief tripped the wrong stone. And in one bizarre case, sharp flint shards scattered across the floor like ancient Lego pieces, ready to slice bare feet. You can't help but imagine a gang of ancient robbers tiptoeing through these halls, only to find themselves ankle-deep in gravel, wondering why they didn't just become potters. But let's be honest, most of the booby traps didn't work. Tomb robbing was rampant. From the very beginning. Sometimes the same workers who built the tombs came back later to rob them. They knew the layout. They knew where the goods were hidden. They knew which jars had gold and which were just, well, intestines. And yet the Egyptians kept building. Kept sealing tombs with curse inscriptions. Anyone who enters this tomb shall be devoured by a crocodile and roasted on a fire. That's a paraphrase, of course. But the idea stands: stay out, or face divine barbecue. You wander past the crumbling stone wall. Beyond it is another chamber, this one filled with reliefs of servants, carved in profile, carrying food, pouring beer, grinding grain. They're all facing the same direction, walking toward a seated figure. The deceased. This wasn't just decoration. It was spiritual automation. In the afterlife, these carved figures would magically come to life, providing eternal service to the tomb's occupant. Think of them as an early attempt at afterlife AI. You spot a few shabby figurines, tiny statues tucked into niches. These were backups. Little laborers, often inscribed with spells to activate them in the next world. If Osiris asked the soul to plow a field, the shabby would rise, tools in hand, and do it instead. Because apparently even in paradise there might still be chores. And just beyond the shabdis, you see something more unsettling. A sealed niche, its stone plug still intact. You lean closer and see faint hieroglyphs above it. Not a name, not a prayer. But a warning. Do not open. The voice of the deceased is angry. You step back. Some historians believe these were symbolic. Others believe they were genuine deterrents, meant to scare off superstitious grave robbers. Either way, they speak to a lingering truth. Even the dead didn't feel entirely safe. Which is why some tombs were built with burial shafts, deep vertical pits that dropped the coffin dozens of feet below ground, accessible only by secret passages. Some were covered with crumbling plaster, so any weight above would collapse the floor. You walk carefully. One step to the left, and you see it, a square hole, barely wider than your shoulders, descending into pitch black. It smells wrong. You're not going down there. But someone did, once. They carried the mummy down those winding shafts. By torchlight. Through dust and silence. past fake doors and sleeping Shabtas. They placed the body in its final chamber, then sealed it, painted the walls, left offerings, whispered prayers, and then they walked away. You imagine that moment, the last flicker of the torchlight, the last human breath before the tomb was sealed. Forever. Except, of course, forever didn't last. Tombs were looted, bodies disturbed, gold melted, prayers scattered. But still, some survived. Hidden chambers, secret passages, and in them, mummies still lie in wait, wrapped, preserved, dreaming. Maybe that's the irony. The Egyptians tried to protect the dead with walls, traps, curses, and mazes. But what really preserved them was time, dust, and sometimes pure luck. You glance back at the fake door. It doesn't open. But it doesn't have to. Because behind it, the soul still walks. Still receives bread and beer. Still listens for the sound of footsteps, someone coming to speak their name once more. And tonight? That someone is you. You're back in the open again. Sort of. A thin shaft of moonlight slips in from a crack high above, illuminating a small burial pit. No murals, no gold leaf, no priest chanting spells in perfect cadence. Just sand, stones, and what appears to be a bundle wrapped in linen, badly at that, and half exposed to the desert air. You take a knee and brush away a few grains of sand. The linen falls apart in your hand. The body beneath is little more than bones now, weathered, dry, and sun-bleached. This is not a pharaoh. This is someone else. Someone ordinary. And tonight you're about to meet the mummified middle class. We tend to picture ancient Egypt through the lens of kings and gods, pyramids, gold masks, perfect preservation. But most Egyptians? They didn't have that luxury. They weren't buried in elaborate tombs. They didn't get resin massages or canopic jars with falcon head lids. They got what they could afford. And what they could afford was sand. Welcome to the reality of budget mummification. You walk past the shallow grave and into a dim chamber not carved from stone but shaped by mud brick. It's rough. Functional. Somewhere between a storage closet and a sacred shrine. And on one side, a row of linen-wrapped bodies lies tucked against the wall, like sleeping bundles. They look unfinished. And that's because, in many cases, they were. Mummification for the lower classes was often partial. Maybe the body was washed. Maybe the organs were left inside. Maybe a priest came by and muttered a quick spell. Maybe not. If you had just enough money, you might pay for some natron, a cheap, communal batch, already used once or twice. You'd dry out in a shared pit. Think of it like a group sauna, except everyone's already dead. You might get a single layer of linen. Or your family might skip the wrapping entirely and go for a reed mat. Some folks were buried naked, hoping the desert heat would do what the embalmers couldn't. And surprisingly, it often did. In fact, some of the best preserved bodies from early Egyptian history weren't embalmed at all. They were simply buried in shallow sand pits where the dry climate desiccated them naturally. You reach into a corner of the chamber and pull out a faded basket. Inside are the remnants of a wooden comb, a few beads, and a scrap of linen with faint red stitching. Not royal. Not elaborate. But personal. Intimate. A reminder that love, not luxury, often shaped these burials. And yet, even among the poor, there was creativity. Some families pooled their resources. hired freelance embalmers who traveled from village to village. Got the basic package, maybe with an amulet thrown in. One tomb inscription reads, "For my mother, who could not afford a tomb, I dug with my own hands." Others improvised. Used honey to coat the body. Or packed it in salt and wrapped it in old temple linens. Some were buried with only a painted pot beside them, a final offering of grain or beer. And still, the symbolism remained. You find a scrap of pottery etched with a crude drawing, a stick figure, arms outstretched, flanked by stars and a crescent moon. No fancy spells, but the message is clear: this person was reaching for the sky. Even the poorest Egyptians believed in the afterlife. And even if they couldn't afford a Book of the Dead, they might whisper the words they'd heard at temple. They might carve a symbol of the Ankh, life, onto a rock. They might tuck a lock of hair into the wrappings, to carry a memory. You move to another part of the room. This one smells faintly of dust and earth, but also of something sweeter, resin, faint and faded. Someone had saved up for a touch of luxury. A small pot sits beside the head of the mummy, still half full. You dip a finger in. It's thick, sticky. Smells like pine and age. A splurge, maybe? For a final farewell. And not all commoner burials were equal. There were gradations. If you were a mid-level scribe, a merchant, or a priest's cousin's cousin, you might get a proper linen wrap and a mask made of painted plaster. Nothing fancy, but enough to give your spirit direction. Maybe even a line of hieroglyphs. May you rise in peace. Some middle-class burials even used recycled coffins. Yes, recycled. Tomb robbers would strip the gold, but leave the box. Embalmers would scrub off the old names, paint on the new ones, and voila, new tenant, same eternal apartment. You pause at one such coffin, propped open and empty now. The paint is chipped, the face faded. But under the lid, you spot something unusual, a second name, faintly scratched through. Historians still debate, was this out of desperation? Dishonesty? Or just practicality? Maybe all three. And then there's the other side of low-budget burial, the not-so-honest side. Some embalmers offered fake services. Told grieving families that everything was being done, just like for the nobles, when in fact they skipped steps. Left the body to dry without organs removed. Wrapped it quickly. Took the payment and moved on. It's tragic, but also painfully familiar. Even 5,000 years ago, funerals could be scams. And yet, there was always meaning. Always effort. You crouch beside a body barely more than bones now, wrapped in fragments of linen and laid in a reed basket. No inscriptions. No amulets. But tucked beside it is a single seashell. Maybe it meant something. A memory of a childhood by the Nile. A symbol of rebirth. Or just something beautiful to hold on to in the dark. The breeze whispers through the chamber, lifting a corner of cloth. The body doesn't move. But in your mind, you see the spirit rise, slowly, gently, blinking in the starlight. Not dressed in gold. Not surrounded by spells. Just remembered. Just loved. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to reach the other side. The poor may have gone quietly into the sand, but upstairs, oh, upstairs was a different story entirely. You feel it before you see it, the smoothness of the stone, the air that smells faintly of cinnamon and copper coins. You follow a torchlit corridor that widens, brightens, unfolds, until suddenly, you step into a space unlike any other you've seen so far. It's a workshop. not a shrine, not a tomb. This is where the business of death was done. People think of mummification as sacred, and it was. But it was also an industry. With tools, supply chains, service tiers, and a clientele that ranged from royalty to well-off goat herders with modest savings and big dreams of eternal comfort. You look around and start taking mental notes. Over there? That's a slab for preparing bodies. Behind it, rows of shelves, each one lined with jars, tools, folded linen, resin blocks, and stacks of labels. You're standing in a mortuary studio. And someone is running a tight operation. Ancient Thebes, especially in its heyday, was crawling with embalming workshops. Some were temple-run, managed by priests of Anubis and outfitted like religious labs. Others were family-run businesses, passed down like any artisan craft. And just like today, they came with their own, let's say, customer service levels. You hear faint voices echoing from a side room, negotiations maybe. A man is bartering with a priest in linen robes. You catch fragments. No canopic jars, just heart, budget spell. The grieving process in ancient Egypt, you realize, came with a price list. There was a basic package, partial drying, minimal wrapping, no ceremony. Or the deluxe, 70 days of preservation, full organ removal, mouth-opening ritual, and a high-gloss finish with custom incense blend. A famous papyrus, discovered in Saqqara, records an itemized mummification menu. It literally includes different rates for removal of the brain, use of imported cedar oil, number of days in natron, amulet count, type of coffin wood, sycamore, local, cedar, pricey import, gold leaf, you better be pharaoh. This wasn't just about faith. It was commerce. And it wasn't always pretty. You wander past a low bench and spot a drawer full of scalpels. Bronze, sharp, each worn smooth from years of use. Next to it, rolls of linen dyed in various shades. On the far wall? A price board, well, okay, a painted list of service tiers and rituals. Like a menu in a very morbid cafe. And then there were specialists. One person might only be in charge of removing the organs. Another was a resin mixer, carefully boiling down oils. Another was the amulet placer, trained to know exactly where to tuck each charm in the layers of wrapping. You even had funeral directors, in a sense, priests who handled the paperwork, organized the mourners, and delivered the final rites. Sometimes, clients would bring in additional items, jewelry, makeup, even favorite food items, to be included in the burial. And yes, the embalmers charged for placement. Want that little clay model of your pet goose to sit beside your thigh instead of being stuffed under your feet? That's an extra few deben of copper. This sounds clinical, maybe even cynical. But it wasn't exploitation. It was logistics. The afterlife was important. It was a spiritual journey, yes, but it was also project management. And someone had to handle the spreadsheets, well, papyri. Still, the system wasn't perfect. There are records of mummification fraud. Embalmers reusing old linen. Swapping out real amulets for clay ones. Using cheap resin mixed with animal fat. In one case, a mummifier simply didn't embalm the body at all, just wrapped it up in bandages and called it a day. Authorities cracked down when they could, especially in Thebes. But policing mummification fraud was about as effective as policing used car sales in a busy bazaar. You pause in front of a low work table. Laid out on it are the tools of the trade, obsidian blades, reed brushes, linen rolls, small ink pots, and a wax tablet with names scratched into it, perhaps a waiting list. One name has a small star beside it. Priority customer, maybe? Nearby, a small brazier burns softly. Beside it are molds for amulets, eyes, scarabs, inks. You can imagine the apprentice pressing clay into the mold, drying it in the fire, painting it with crushed lapis or carnelian, churning out magical protections like tiny factory widgets. And then you find it. A ledger. A long papyrus scroll listing names, services, payments made. It's partly burned, but you can make out one note. Family requested full rights, paid for partial. Added gold foil to mask as compromise. A negotiation. A compromise between faith and funds. The universal human story. You smile. Because this isn't so different from today. We plan funerals. We haggle. We cry. We want to do right by the dead, even when the budget argues otherwise. And for the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't just the end of life, it was the start of eternity. No one wanted to mess that up. So they did what they could. Bought what they could. Trusted strangers in white linen to do the rest. You step away from the workshop. Behind you, the embalmers go on, measuring, anointing, wrapping, chanting. A quiet industry powered by hope and ritual and the endless desert wind. And you wonder, how many people passed through this place, never known to history, but remembered, however briefly, by those who paid to keep their names alive? Thousands, maybe. Tens of thousands. Each one wrapped. Each one blessed. Each one billed. You follow the sound of soft paw steps. Not your imagination. Not this time. You round a corner and find yourself in a chamber smaller than the others, lower ceiling, simpler decoration. No golden murals, no towering stone statues. Just shelves. Rows and rows of clay jars, little sarcophagi, and linen bundles. And at the center? A cat. Mummified. Perfectly preserved, with tiny ears wrapped tight in linen, and painted eyes still staring upward. Welcome to the animal section of the afterlife. You always knew the Egyptians loved animals. But you didn't know they went this far. Because it turns out, pets weren't just companions, they were spiritual co-pilots, divine avatars, sacred offerings. And sometimes, they got the mummy treatment too. You walk slowly down the rows. Each shelf tells a story. There's a baboon, curled up tight, wearing what might have once been a little collar. A hawk, wings pressed close to its sides, eyes painted in careful black lines. A dog still noble in repose, with linen folds tucked gently around its snout like a scarf against desert winds. And cats. So many cats. Lined up like they're waiting for some celestial food bowl to be filled. The Egyptians didn't just love cats, they revered them. The goddess Batet was their protector, part woman, part lioness or house cat, depending on the century. Cats represented grace, agility, fertility, and the ability to walk between worlds. Killing a cat, even by accident, was a serious offense. There are reports of mobs attacking Roman soldiers who so much as looked at a feline the wrong way. So when cats died, they weren't tossed aside. They were mourned. Sometimes even mummified with more care than their owners. You spot a particularly ornate feline coffin, made of bronze. Shaped like a seated cat, ears alert, tail curled. The hieroglyphs on its side read, "Beloved of Batet. May she walk beside her master in the field of reeds." This wasn't just about loyalty. It was strategy. In the afterlife, you need all the allies you could get. So why not bring your pets? They'd guide you, guard you, keep you company on the boat through the underworld, fetch you your sandals, chase off any underworld rats. But there's another side to this, less personal, more transactional. You enter a side room filled with smaller jars. Simpler, cruder. Many are broken. Inside? Tiny bones. Mummified animals weren't just pets. They were also offerings, mass-produced, sold at temples, and sacrificed in the name of devotion. Want Bastet's favor? Buy a cat mummy. Want a good harvest? Try an ibis. Need to win a court case? Maybe a sacred bull figurine wrapped in gold leaf will help. This was big business. Some temples had entire breeding grounds for sacrificial animals. Cats, falcons, snakes. Raised specifically to be mummified and sold to pilgrims. You'd visit a temple, pay your fee, and receive a gift to the gods. A little linen-wrapped animal, sometimes carefully embalmed, sometimes not so much. Because with demand came shortcuts. Archaeologists have found thousands of animal mummies that are empty, no bones, no remains. Just linen and air. Or sometimes a few rocks to give it weight. Scam? Maybe. Or maybe just symbolic. You hold one such bundle in your hand. Featherlight. Painted eyes. You can't tell if there's anything inside. Maybe that's the point. Because in Egypt, symbol mattered. The act of offering, even if the cat was imagined, was enough to show devotion. But not all animals were offerings. Some were true companions. You find a burial pit nearby, its walls painted with scenes of a man sitting beside a dog, long ears, pointed nose. The inscription calls the dog the faithful one who brings me home. Dogs were guides, protectors, hunters, and friends. Some were buried in their own coffins. Others in their master's tomb. One tomb even includes a eulogy. He was a good dog. He never barked without cause. And then, there were sacred animals. Certain creatures weren't just respected, they were worshipped. The Apis bull, for example, was considered an embodiment of the god Ta. Only one Apis bull lived at a time, chosen for its markings, cared for in luxury, and mummified with full royal honors after death. Its tombs were massive, underground catacombs filled with huge stone sarcophagi, each weighing several tons. You shiver, imagining priests guiding a 2,000-pound bull mummy into place, chanting hymns, lighting incense, offering dates and milk. The reverence is real. Because in their eyes, these animals weren't lesser beings. They were links. Bridges between the mortal world and the divine. And so, they were wrapped. Sealed. Painted. Prayed over. And laid to rest. You pass a niche where a mongoose lies wrapped beside a cobra. Eternal enemies, together forever. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe someone just had a strange sense of humor. The air here smells of dried straw and faded perfume. You feel the presence of so many small souls, creatures who were once stroked, fed, chased, laughed at. And now remembered. You crouch before one cat, nose slightly crooked, paw curled in sleep. You whisper, just in case. You are a good cat. May you walk beside your person in the sun. And in the stillness, you think you hear a purr. The purring fades behind you, like the memory of warmth. You rise from the chamber of paws and feathers, and the air shifts again, cooler now, thinner. You're climbing. The passage winds upward, tighter with every step. Your fingers trail along rough stone as echoes of footsteps, past and present, mingle in the dark. Then, without warning, the walls widen. You stumble into a broad, high-ceilinged hall. And here, the stillness breaks. Statues flank the walls, Osiris, arms crossed, Isis, wings spread wide, Anubis, frozen in mid-step. Murals bloom in rich, vivid color, preserved against time. Gold leaf still clings in patches. And at the center? A coffin. Massive. Gilded. Painted with blue lapis and the deepest of blacks. The face on the lid stares upward, serene and powerful. This is not just a burial. This is a performance. Welcome to the theater of power. Because while every mummy told a story, royal mummies? They told an empire. You walk the perimeter of the chamber. Each wall is a stage set. Soldiers, servants, fields of grain, sacred boats, celestial bodies. It's not art, it's propaganda, woven with theology. In ancient Egypt, death was the great equalizer, except when it wasn't. The elite, especially pharaohs, were buried like gods because they were gods. Or at least, god-adjacent. Living avatars of Horus, dying as Osiris, reborn as Ra. A celestial job title with great benefits and a dramatic exit package. And their funerals? Nothing short of epic. The most famous was likely that of Seti I, whose tomb winds deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. Or Ramses II, the Great, who received layers of wrappings so thick, he practically resembled a mattress by the time he was sealed. But even lesser royals knew how to command attention. Mummification became ritualized political theater. The more elaborate the preparation, the more divine you appeared. And the audience? Both mortal and immortal. You noticed something odd near the sarcophagus. A second coffin, smaller. Less ornate. But still honored. Royal burials often included entourages, wives, children, even high-ranking officials. Some by choice. Others maybe less so. The most unsettling example? Tombs with servant mummies, possibly retainers sacrificed to serve their king in death. Though later on, they were replaced with symbolic figurines. Less messy. Still, the burial of a pharaoh wasn't just about the man, it was about the message. Here lies the center of the cosmos. The walls seemed to say. This is the axis around which order spins. Everything was symbolic. The tomb's direction, always facing west, the land of the dead, where the sun disappeared. The colors, blue for rebirth, gold for eternity, red for protection. The coffin shape, curved like the womb of Nut, the sky goddess, because death was not an ending, but a return. And perhaps most stunning? The sheer repetition of ritual. Over and over, the same spell. The same anointing. The same gesture. Because repetition meant power, etching eternity into reality by sheer persistence. Some scholars argue this wasn't just spirituality. It was politics. Every priest who took part in the burial reaffirmed the divine right of kings. Every audience member saw the wealth, the sacredness, the control. Even the tomb's design sent a message. I am so powerful, I can command artisans to dig a cathedral into a mountain. And yet, you crouch by the wall and brush your hand across a patch of faded paint. Time doesn't care about performance. Even royal tombs were looted. Bodies moved. Ramses II had to be relocated, twice. Priests, fearing desecration, stashed his corpse with others in secret caches. His final resting place? Not a golden hall, but a hidden tomb in Deir el-Bahri, among dozens of others. A dusty filing cabinet of royalty. Even Tutankhamun, the most famous mummy of all, was buried in a hastily reused tomb. His death was sudden, his preparations rushed. And yet he remains the symbol of Egypt's golden age, simply because his tomb stayed, mostly intact. Historians still debate how much of mummification was genuine belief, and how much was calculated spectacle. Was every spell heartfelt? Or was it just good PR? Maybe both. You glance back at the grand sarcophagus. Inside may lie a ruler who once commanded armies, changed calendars, ordered temples built in their name. And yet here they are. Silent. Sealed. Their divinity a matter of dust and hope. You circle slowly, noting the final details. Tiny scrolls tucked into crevices, like divine footnotes. Amulets shaped like cobras, ready to strike any spiritual threat. A scarab the size of your palm, placed just above where the heart would have been, inscribed with a plea. Do not betray me when I am judged. Even gods fear judgment. You pause. Because despite the grandeur, the gold, the showmanship, there's something deeply human beneath it all. A desire to be remembered, yes, but also to be understood. The pharaohs didn't want to vanish into myth. They wanted to be seen, not as symbols, but as souls. And you, standing here thousands of years later, are proof that in some small way, it worked. You whisper their name. And somewhere beyond this chamber, beyond the duet, beyond memory and star, perhaps, they hear it. The golden sarcophagus fades behind you, its grandeur lingering in your mind like perfume in an empty ballroom. But as the glow of divinity fades, something stranger takes its place, laughter. Not joyous. Not mocking. Just confused. You walk into a new chamber, smaller and dimmer than the rest. On the walls, the art is different. Gone are the perfect hieroglyphs, the serene gods, the formal processions. These murals are lively, chaotic, almost comic. One shows a group of men gawking at a mummy, pointing and gesturing. Another depicts what looks suspiciously like a man trying to mummify a fish. There's even a badly drawn ibis in the corner with exaggerated eyelashes. You raise an eyebrow. You've stumbled into the world of the Greek tourists. By the 5th century BC, Egypt had already been mummifying their dead for thousands of years. But now, new visitors had arrived. Curious. Wealthy. Confused. And often, hilariously wrong. When the Greeks arrived in Egypt, some as traders, others as conquerors, they were awed. Imagine stepping off a boat and seeing the pyramids, the temples of Karnak, the sprawling city of Thebes. A civilization that felt older than time. And like all tourists, they tried to make sense of it. Mostly by guessing. You move to the center of the room, where a large stone panel depicts the story of Osiris, except in this version, he seems to be swimming? Ah, yes. One of the more colorful Greek interpretations. Some Greek writers believed that Egyptian gods like Osiris and Horus were originally human kings who became gods through fame. Others thought they were astronomical symbols, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And then there was Herodotus, often called the father of history, but also, let's be honest, kind of a gossip. He visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and wrote extensive accounts of their customs, especially mummification. According to him, the brain was pulled out through the nostrils using an iron hook, correct, though some details are sketchy. There were 3 price tiers for embalming, also correct. and priests wept openly during embalming, while also demanding high fees. He also described the heart being left in place, which we now know isn't always true, and made dramatic claims about other rituals that modern archaeology can't fully confirm. But his enthusiasm? Impeccable. The Greeks were fascinated by Egyptian rituals. Some thought mummification granted true immortality. Others believed the Egyptians worshipped animals as gods, which led to some serious cultural misunderstandings. You move toward a painted clay tablet. It shows a Greek man presenting a cat mummy to a priest, who looks bewildered. Maybe because the man is wearing the cat as a hat. There are even texts from later Greeks who thought mummification involved bathing the dead in honey, or pickling them like olives. Not entirely true. Though, in fairness, honey was used in some embalming practices. Its antibacterial properties were handy, and it made a fine preservative. But soaking a corpse in it? That's probably a bit of creative interpretation. Or culinary confusion. And then, there was the idea that mummies had magical powers. Yes. Real magical powers. As Egyptian culture declined and became more mythologized, mummies were increasingly seen as mystical objects. In later periods, Greek and Roman collectors actually ground up mummy flesh into powder, believing it could cure diseases, stop bleeding, or increase vitality. Mumia, they called it. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Even into the Renaissance and early modern period, people were still buying powdered mummy on the black market, smearing it on wounds, or mixing it into paint. Artists would ask for mummy brown pigment, yes, made with actual dead people. You sigh. The dead deserve better. But back to the Greeks. They loved stories. So when they couldn't understand the rituals, they reimagined them. One tale claimed that the Egyptian dead were placed on boats, floated out to the middle of the Nile, and eaten by sacred fish, who then became vessels for the soul. Others thought the pyramids were giant grain silos, built by enslaved magicians who carried stones with spells. And yet, even through the confusion, you sense admiration. The Greeks didn't mock the Egyptians, they were in awe of them. They called the priests of Egypt the wisest men on earth. They tried to link their gods to Egyptian ones, Hermes with Thoth, Zeus with Ammonius, Aphrodite with Hathor. They adopted Egyptian fashion, rituals, even burial styles. Greek mummies have been found in Egypt, wrapped in linen and resin, but with painted portraits instead of masks, combining Egyptian form with Greek individuality. You walk past one such portrait. A woman, young, dark eyes wide, lips slightly parted. Her hair is curled in the Roman style. Around her neck, a painted necklace. Beneath her? Linen. Resin. Dust. Two worlds. One mummy. Even in misunderstanding, cultures met. Changed. Became something new. You pause at the exit, glancing back at the cartoonish ibis and the overly enthusiastic Greek in a fish hat. You can't help but smile. Because sometimes the strangest stories are born not from disrespect, but from the effort to understand. And while the Greeks may not have gotten all the details right, they tried. They looked at a world wrapped in mystery and thought, maybe if I draw it, name it, explain it, it'll make sense. It didn't. Not really. But the effort itself? That was a kind of reverence. The drawings of Greeks and their overly enthusiastic interpretations fade into darkness behind you, and you find yourself walking deeper, further from wonder, closer to silence. The walls here are bare. No gods. No hieroglyphs. No stars painted overhead. The stone is rough, the air still. And in that stillness, you begin to sense the edge of something. Not the edge of space. Not the edge of understanding. But the edge of an era. You've arrived at a time when the ancient art of mummification was no longer the beating heart of Egyptian belief. When the world shifted, and new empires brought new ideas, and the rituals that once defined life and death were left behind like crumbling cartonnage. This is the Roman period. And beyond it, the early Christian era. The final chapters in the story of Egyptian mummification. And things change. You walk slowly down a corridor that looks like a tomb but isn't, at least not in the way the ancient priests would recognize. The body on the stone table is wrapped, yes, but there are no canopic jars, no scarabs, no gods with animal heads painted above. Instead, there's a face, a lifelike portrait, painted in encaustic wax, staring up at you. It's jarring. Human. Immediate. The Fayum portraits, they're called. Hundreds of them, from the Greco-Roman period in Egypt, men, women, children, painted with stunning realism, each mounted on linen-wrapped bodies. You kneel beside one. A boy, maybe 8 or 9. Wide brown eyes, dark curly hair, a faint smile. There's no mask, no gilded beard. But somehow, he feels more present than anyone you've met tonight. These were still mummies. But the symbolism had shifted. The Greco-Roman world wasn't concerned with the Dut. Osiris and Anubis faded into the background. The field of reeds was replaced by the Elysian fields, and later, by visions of heaven and hell. Even the burial practices adapted. Romans in Egypt still embalmed the dead, but the rituals were stripped down. Less resin, fewer amulets, no 70-day wait. The sacred became serviceable. The mysteries became methods. And soon, even those began to vanish. Because something else was rising. A new faith. You step into the next chamber, and it's not a tomb at all. It's a chapel. A simple cross is carved above a doorway. The incense smells different. The prayers, what little echo remains, are in Greek, not in the sacred tongue of Thoth and scribes. Christianity had arrived. And with it came a profound shift in the way Egyptians thought about bodies, souls, and what lay beyond. To the early Christians, preserving the body wasn't necessary. In fact, it bordered on blasphemous. Resurrection wasn't something you engineered with linen and natron, it was something granted by grace. So mummification was abandoned. Gradually. Reluctantly. Some families clung to old rituals, blending them with new ones. There are Christian mummies, wrapped bodies buried with crosses, even psalms written in Coptic tucked into their bindings. But eventually, the old art faded. The embalmers disappeared. The resin cooled. The silence grew. You find a room where mummification tools lie untouched, bronze hooks, dried out linen, broken amulet molds. Dust lies thick across them like a final shroud. No one has used them in centuries. You feel it in your chest. Not sadness, exactly. Something quieter. An ache for endings. But this isn't tragedy. It's evolution. Cultures change. Beliefs shift. One sacred order makes way for another. And sometimes, even the most powerful rituals are gently set down. The last official mummifications in Egypt happened around the 4th century CE. After that, it became a memory. A curiosity. And eventually? A commodity. You walk through a final doorway and find yourself in an entirely different kind of space. White walls. Bright lights. Glass cases. A museum. You're suddenly thousands of years forward, standing beneath the quiet hum of track lighting, staring at a mummy behind plexiglass. The linen is still there. The paint faded but proud. There's a placard with a name, or at least a catalog number. The body lies still, watched by visitors who whisper and point. And you can't help but wonder, is this what they wanted? Did the priest who chanted over this body imagine it would be displayed beside schoolchildren and vending machines? Did the soul of the wrapped man ever imagine being unwrapped by curious archaeologists? Historians still argue. Some believe displaying mummies is educational. Others say it's disrespectful. Still others insist it's the only reason these bodies have survived at all. What's undeniable is this. They were meant to be remembered. And remembered they are. In museums. In textbooks. In stories. In whispers. You press your hand to the glass. And for a moment you see not a corpse but a person, someone who lived, who laughed, who feared the dark and loved the scent of lotus flowers and believed, with all their heart, that they'd rise again. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they did. But their journey, from body to symbol to memory, continues. And now? You're a part of it. You don't remember when you sat down. Somewhere between the tombs and the museums, between painted eyes and whispered prayers, your body found stillness. Your mind, though, continues walking. Because the story isn't quite over. You're in a chamber that doesn't belong to any time at all. A place that feels like dusk, either day nor night, either ancient nor modern. Just quiet. All around you are fragments. A shred of linen. A broken resin jar. A bead shaped like a lotus. A cat's paw, wrapped tightly and curled in rest. They don't belong together, not really. But somehow they make sense. Like scattered lines from a poem lost to the wind. This is the place of afterthoughts. Because even after mummification ended, after tombs were looted, after the gods were traded for others, and the scrolls for scriptures, people still looked backward. Still wondered. Still asked, why did they do it? And the answers, like the wrappings, come in layers. Some say the Egyptians mummified their dead to preserve identity, that the body was the soul's anchor, its mirror in flesh. Others say it was about control. About mastering the uncontrollable, outwitting time itself, declaring with every wrap of linen, you will not take me easily. There's a theory, one of my favorites, that says mummification was a ritual of reunion. That death tore apart the pieces of the self, the ka, the ba, the name, the shadow, the heart. And wrapping the body? That was how you stitched it all back together. Thread by thread. Spell by spell. Name by name. You shift slightly. The stone beneath you is cold now. The torchlight flickers low. There's something deeply comforting in this dimness, like being swaddled in a story. Outside this chamber, the world spins forward. Tourists walk through air-conditioned galleries. Scholars debate whether that scarab belonged on the left side of the chest or the right. Children press their noses to museum glass and ask, was she a queen? And somewhere, far away, in the desert's throat, another tomb is unearthed. Another linen-wrapped mystery, blinking into the light after thousands of years of darkness. And maybe you wonder, sitting here in this moment suspended from time, will we be remembered that way? Not with gold, or jars, or spells, but with love, with curiosity, with care. Maybe memory is the closest thing we have to resurrection. And in remembering the ancient Egyptians, their fears, their beauty, their endlessly folded rituals, We become a part of that memory. Not just as observers, but as fellow travelers in the long, strange journey of being human. You exhale slowly. The air around you dims further. The chamber softens. The edges of things blur. Even the sharp smell of resin begins to fade into something more abstract. You lean your head back, listening to the faint echoes of chants from long ago. You think about the mother who couldn't afford a coffin, so she dug a grave with her hands. You think about the apprentice who folded his first strip of linen, whispering the name of a stranger. You think about the priest who sealed a heart scarab with trembling fingers, praying that it would not betray its master. You think about the cat, curled and purring forever, and the pharaoh, buried with spells, wrapped in layers of pride and fear and power. They're all here now. You're not alone. You're among the wrapped, the remembered, the eternal. So close your eyes. Let the dirt drift around you like mist. There are no serpents here. No scales. Only soft linen. And the warmth of memory, gently pressing against you like a second skin.